the Robinson family got lost in space.
Yeah, the series was set in the far future, 1997.
Hey, what if I told you that one of the most beloved science fiction shows in television history was almost completely different? What if the characters you grew up loving were never supposed to exist at all? And what if the man who wrote the music for Star Wars got his start helping a family survive in outer space? Sounds wild, right? Well, buckle up, because today we're diving deep into one of the most fascinating shows ever made. We're talking about Lost in Space, and trust me, by the time this video is over, you are going to see that show in a completely different way. Whether you watched it as a kid, caught reruns late at night, or just know the robot's famous warning from pop culture, there are things hiding in the history of this show that will genuinely blow your mind. Some of these facts are funny, some are sad, some will make you shake your head and laugh, and at least one of them will make you go, wait, seriously? So let's not waste another second. Let's get into it. Let's start with something that still makes people laugh and cringe at the same time. Picture this. It's the third season of Lost in Space. The show is still on the air, fans are still tuning in every week, and the writers sit down to figure out what wild adventure the Robinson family should go on next. And what do they come up with? A giant talking carrot. No, seriously, there was an episode where the crew runs into a human-sized carrot named Tybo, who has the power to turn people into plants. Now look, Lost in Space had done some pretty out-there stuff before, but this was on another level entirely. Even the people who worked on the show knew it was a lot. The man who wrote the episode reportedly felt so embarrassed about the script that he actually tried to keep it hidden from one of the main actors before filming started. He didn't want the actor to read it ahead of time because he was worried about what the reaction would be. And it gets better. The original plan for that episode included a real live llama, an actual animal on set, walking around among the cast and crew. But here's the thing about llamas. They are not exactly known for being cooperative. This particular llama kept spitting at everyone. The actors, the crew, the director, nobody was safe. It was total chaos. Eventually, the production team gave up and just wrote the llama out of the episode entirely. But by that point, the damage was kind of already done. The whole thing had become a symbol of just how far the show had drifted from its original vision. And here's the part that really stings. That episode aired just 1 week before the very last episode of the series ever. Some people who study television history believe that episode, with its talking vegetable villain and its barnyard chaos, might have actually helped push the show toward cancellation. Whether you find it funny or frustrating, that carrot episode remains one of the strangest pieces of television ever put on screen. Now let's talk about the most famous character on the whole show, Dr. Zachary Smith. If you've ever watched Lost in Space, you know this guy. He's dramatic, he's selfish, he's always getting into trouble, and he somehow always finds a way to make everything about himself. Fans absolutely loved him. But here's something most people don't know. Dr. Smith was never supposed to stick around. When the show was first being planned, the character was written as a simple villain. His whole job was to sabotage the Robinson family's mission and send them spiraling off into deep space. After that, he was supposed to be gone, done, out of the story, a one-and-done bad guy who served his purpose and disappeared. But the actor who played him, a man named Jonathan Harris, had a completely different idea. Harris was smart, experienced, and he understood something that the writers maybe hadn't fully figured out yet. He saw that there was something more interesting hiding inside this character. Instead of playing Dr. Smith as pure evil, Harris started making little changes. He gave the character a flair for the dramatic. He made him cowardly and vain and constantly complaining. He filled every scene with wit and self-pity and ridiculous overreaction. And something magical happened. The audience fell in love with him. People weren't just tolerating Dr. Smith, they were watching the show because of him. His constant moaning, his theatrical gasps, his habit of calling everyone around him by dramatic nicknames, it all became the heart and soul of the series. What started as a throwaway villain ended up becoming the most memorable character in the entire show. And honestly, a lot of people believe that without Dr. Smith, Lost in Space would have faded away much sooner than it did. And speaking of Jonathan Harris, let's talk about one of the smartest moves any television actor has ever made. When Harris joined the show, he had a special request. He didn't want to be listed in the credits the same way as everyone else. Instead of being shown as a regular cast member, he wanted to be called a special guest star. Now, on the surface, that might sound like a weird vanity thing, but think about it for a second. every single person watching the show at home would see those words on screen every single week, special guest star. It gave the impression that Dr. Smith was somehow above the rest of the cast, like he was doing everyone a favor just by showing up. It made him seem more important, more prestigious, more untouchable. And here's the funny part. Harris appeared in essentially every episode of the series. He was just as much a regular cast member as anyone else, but because of those three little words on screen, he seemed like he was on a completely different level. The producers agreed to it, and from that point on, every episode opened with that special billing just for him. Nobody else in the main cast got that treatment. It was a clever, calculated move that reinforced exactly the kind of character he was playing. Dr. Smith thought he was better than everyone around him, and now even the credits were saying the same thing. It was the character leaking out into real life, and it worked perfectly. Now here's a sweet story hiding underneath all the space adventures and alien monsters. While the cameras were rolling and the Robinson family was fighting off cosmic dangers week after week, something real and human was happening just off screen. Billy Mumy, the young actor who played Will Robinson, and Angela Cartwright, who played his sister, Penny, started out as just friends. They were kids working on a TV set together, growing up in front of the cameras, spending long days on the same stages and sets. Over time, that friendship deepened into something more. As they got older, they began dating. And this wasn't just a small crush that lasted a few weeks. They were together for several years. At one point, they were even engaged. Think about that for a moment. Two kids who played brother and sister on one of the most famous science fiction shows in history actually fell in love with each other in real life. There's something genuinely touching about that. They grew up together in one of the strangest, most unique work environments you can imagine. They shared the experience of being young actors on a hit show, of learning their lines and facing the cameras, and navigating Hollywood at an age when most kids were just worried about homework. That shared experience created a bond that lasted long after the show ended. Even when the relationship eventually came to a close, the two of them stayed close friends for decades. And when you go back and watch their scenes together on the show, knowing what was really happening between them, it adds a whole new layer of warmth to everything. Their chemistry on screen wasn't just good acting. A lot of it was very, very real. Let's go back to the very beginning now, before the show even started, before it had a name anyone recognized, before there was a robot or Dr. Smith or any of the things that made it iconic. There was a pilot episode that almost nobody has ever seen. It was called No Place to Hide, and it told the story of the Robinson family heading into space for the very first time. But here's the twist. In that original version, there was no Dr. Smith at all, and there was no robot. Two of the most important characters in the entire history of the show didn't exist yet. The story was completely different in tone, too. It was more serious, more grounded, more focused on the danger and drama of actual space travel. The family didn't get lost because someone sabotaged their mission. They got knocked off course by a meteor storm, which is a much more realistic and much less exciting reason to be stranded in space. After the network executives watched that pilot, they felt like something was missing. The show needed more tension, more conflict, more personality. So the decision was made to add a villain who would deliberately send the family off course. And alongside that villain, someone brought up the idea of adding a robot character, something that could be both useful and entertaining. Those two additions changed absolutely everything. The serious, grounded space drama became something completely different. It became funnier, more adventurous, more colorful, more unpredictable. And it became beloved. It's one of those moments in television history where you realize how different things could have been with just a few different decisions. The show we know and love only exists because someone looked at that original pilot and said, "This needs something more." Here's one that might surprise you, especially if you grew up watching both of these shows. When it comes to classic science fiction television, there are two giants that everyone knows: Lost in Space and Star Trek. They both launched in the mid-1960s. They both featured crews traveling through outer space. They both became hugely important parts of American pop culture. But what most people don't realize is that both shows were being considered at the same time by television networks, and the people making those decisions could really only pick one. CBS, one of the biggest television networks in the country, had both concepts in front of them at roughly the same time, and they chose Lost in Space. The reasoning made sense at the time. Lost in Space was built around a family, which made it feel more relatable and more accessible to a wider audience.
It felt like an adventure show that everyone could watch together. Star Trek, on the other hand, was a more intellectual concept with a lot of ideas about society and humanity baked into it. CBS passed on it, and Star Trek ended up on NBC instead. Lost in Space launched first in 1965 and was a big hit right away. Star Trek struggled with ratings during its original run and almost got canceled multiple times. But then something happened. Star Trek went into reruns and syndication, and suddenly people everywhere were discovering it and falling in love with it. It grew into one of the most important franchises in the history of entertainment. Meanwhile, Lost in Space ran for 3 seasons and then ended. When you think about it, it's one of the most fascinating what-if moments in television history. What would the world look like today if those decisions had gone the other way? Let's talk about the robot for a minute, because there is so much more going on with that character than most people ever realized. First, let's start with the cost. Building that costume was not cheap. The robot suit was constructed from fiberglass and metal parts and all kinds of intricate pieces, and by the time it was finished, the total price tag had reached $70,000. In today's money, that would be an enormous amount. For a 1960s television budget, it was absolutely staggering. And on top of that, the finished costume weighed nearly 200 pounds. 200 pounds! That's more than most adult men weigh, and somebody had to wear it. That somebody was a stuntman named Bob May. He got the job for a very simple reason. He was one of the few people who could actually fit inside the suit. But fitting inside it and performing inside it were two very different things. The visibility was terrible. The ventilation was almost non-existent. Moving around required memorizing every single motion precisely, because even small mistakes inside that metal shell could cause real problems. Bob May endured extreme physical discomfort during long shooting days, sweating through scenes in what was essentially a metal oven on his body. And here's the other thing. The robot's voice wasn't even his. A separate voice actor named Dick Tufeld recorded all of the robot's lines in a studio, and his voice was dubbed over Bob May's movements. So the character you saw on screen was actually 2 different people working together to create one unforgettable performance. And speaking of Dick Tufeld, most fans recognized his voice as the robot, but almost nobody knew he was doing double duty. Every single episode of Lost in Space opened and closed with a narrator's voice, someone guiding the audience through the adventure, setting the scene, explaining what was happening. That narrator was Dick Tufeld. The same man who voiced the robot was also the voice that introduced every episode and wrapped it up at the end. He was doing 2 of the most important audio jobs on the show at the same time, and most viewers had absolutely no idea. Tufeld was already a well-known and respected voice in the entertainment industry before he ever came to Lost in Space. His voice had a quality that was hard to describe, but impossible to ignore. It was authoritative, it was clear, it had weight to it. When he spoke, you listened. And that quality worked perfectly for both roles he was playing. As the narrator, his voice gave the show a sense of importance and drama, even in episodes that were pretty silly. And as the robot, his voice gave the character a personality that went far beyond just a machine reading lines. Dick Tufeld was never seen on screen, never got the kind of recognition that the visible actors received, but his voice was in every single moment of the show, from beginning to end. He was one of the most important parts of Lost in Space, and most people never even knew his name. Now, here's something that shows just how creative and resourceful the production team had to be. Making a science fiction show in the 1960s was expensive. Every week, the crew needed new alien worlds, new gadgets, new technology, new everything. The budget was always under pressure. So the team came up with a solution that was both practical and surprisingly clever. They started reusing props. The same scanner, the same control panel, the same alien artifact would show up in multiple episodes, each time painted a different color or placed in a different spot and called something completely new. Audiences watching at home almost never noticed because the camera angles were chosen carefully and the set dressing was done just well enough to make everything feel fresh. One particular scanning device appeared in at least 3 separate episodes. In each episode, it was presented as a completely different piece of technology with a completely different name and purpose. The prop was the same, only the context changed. This kind of creative recycling wasn't unique to Lost in Space. Lots of shows did it, but the science fiction setting made it both more necessary and more noticeable if you were paying close attention. Everything on that show had to look futuristic and advanced, which meant the props team was constantly working with limited resources to create the illusion of endless innovation. They managed to pull it off week after week, and it's only when you go back and watch everything carefully that you start to catch the repeats. Here's one that connects Lost in Space to its famous rival in a way that most people never suspected. We already talked about how the two shows were kind of competing with each other, coming from different networks and different visions of what science fiction television could be. But behind the scenes, there was more crossover than anyone realized. The two shows sometimes shared the same crew members, including makeup artists and special effects people who moved between productions. And that led to something pretty remarkable.
In one particular Lost in Space episode, the alien characters had a very distinctive look. Pointed ears, specific facial features, a design that felt instantly familiar to anyone who had watched Star Trek. That's because the prosthetics used on those aliens were actually borrowed from the Star Trek makeup department. The Lost in Space crew didn't create new molds or new designs. They literally used pieces that had been made for the rival show. It was a cost-cutting decision made in a time when television budgets were tight and shooting schedules were demanding. But it means that some of the aliens on Lost in Space were, technically speaking, wearing a little piece of Star Trek on their faces. Two shows that felt completely separate to their audiences were, in at least this one small way, quietly sharing the same resources. Let's talk about a mistake that has been confusing hardcore fans for decades. Right at the very beginning of Lost in Space, when the Robinson family launches their mission into space, the date is clearly stated in the episode, October 16th, 1997. That's the day that Jupiter 2 leaves Earth. Simple enough, right? But then in the very next episode, something strange happens. The father of the family, John Robinson, is writing in his mission journal, and he states the date as October 21st, 1997, 5 days later. But then in that same journal entry, he writes that the events he's describing are happening within the first 24 hours of the mission. So which is it? Did the mission launch on the 16th or the 21st? And if it launched on the 16th, how is the 21st still within the first day? Nobody on the show ever addressed this. No explanation was ever given. The writers simply moved on and hoped nobody would catch it. But fans who watched the show carefully absolutely caught it, and it's the kind of detail that drives detail-oriented viewers absolutely crazy. In a show about precise space travel and careful scientific planning, getting the mission's start date wrong 2 episodes in a row is a pretty significant oversight. It's a small thing in the grand scheme of everything the show accomplished, but it's also a perfect example of how quickly things can slip through the cracks when you're producing a television show under constant deadline pressure. Now let's talk about someone who had every reason to be proud and excited about being on Lost in Space, but ended up feeling very differently about the whole experience. Guy Williams was the actor who played John Robinson, the father of the family at the center of everything. Before Lost in Space, Williams had been the star of Zorro, a hugely popular adventure series where he played a dashing hero. He was a legitimate television star, and when he signed on to Lost in Space, he thought he was walking into something similar, a dramatic, serious, adventure-driven show where he would be the central hero. And for a little while, that's what it was. The early episodes were fairly grounded. There was real tension and danger. The Robinson family felt like they were facing genuine threats in a genuinely scary universe. But then the show changed. The humor started creeping in. The stories got sillier. Dr. Smith and the robot became the fan favorites, and suddenly the dramatic space explorer at the center of the show was being pushed further and further into the background. Week after week, Williams found himself standing in scenes that were really all about other characters. His role got smaller as the show got campier. For a classically trained actor who took his work seriously, that was a deeply frustrating experience. By the time the show ended, Williams had essentially given up on Hollywood. He quietly retired and moved to Argentina, where he spent the rest of his life. There's a sad irony there. His earlier work, especially Zorro, was enormously popular in South America. In Argentina, he was treated like a legend, but in the industry that had launched him, he had grown so disillusioned that he simply walked away.
It's a reminder that the version of a show that audiences fall in love with isn't always the version that everyone involved actually wanted to make. Here's something that will make you think differently about every single scene with the robot. You already know that Bob May was inside that 200-pound suit, memorizing his every movement and suffering through long shooting days in an essentially sealed fiberglass shell. But there's one detail about the performance that takes everything to a whole new level. The blinking lights on the robot's chest, those rhythmic pulses of light that made the character feel alive and technological and real, those were not controlled by any kind of automatic system or remote technology. There were no timers, no electronic triggers, no sophisticated controls of any kind. Those lights were activated manually by Bob May's head. Inside the suit, there was a hidden button, and the only way to press it was with a specific movement of his head. So, while Bob May was trying to hit his marks and perform his actions and endure the physical discomfort of being inside a cramped, heavy, overheated metal costume with barely any visibility, he was also thinking about exactly when to move his head just enough to trigger the light sequence. The timing had to be right. The movement had to be precise. It had to look natural, even though it was anything but. Every time you watch the robot's chest lights blinking in perfect rhythm, you're watching a man performing an extraordinary feat of physical coordination and memory under conditions that most performers would find nearly impossible. There's a reason people still remember Bob May with such deep respect. Now here's something that will make you think differently about every single scene with the robot. You already know that Bob May was inside that 200-pound suit, memorizing his every movement and suffering through long shooting days in an essentially sealed fiberglass shell. But there's one detail about the performance that takes everything to a whole new level. The blinking lights on the robot's chest, those rhythmic pulses of light that made the character feel alive and technological and real, those were not controlled by any kind of automatic system or remote technology. There were no timers, no electronic triggers, no sophisticated controls of any kind. Those lights were activated manually by Bob May's head. Inside the suit, there was a hidden button, and the only way to press it was with a specific movement of his head. So, while Bob May was trying to hit his marks and perform his actions and endure the physical discomfort of being inside a cramped, heavy, overheated metal costume with barely any visibility, he was also thinking about exactly when to move his head just enough to trigger the light sequence. The timing had to be right. The movement had to be precise. It had to look natural, even though it was anything but. Every time you watch the robot's chest lights blinking in perfect rhythm, you're watching a man performing an extraordinary feat of physical coordination and memory under conditions that most performers would find nearly impossible. There's a reason people still remember Bob May with such deep respect. Now here's something that speaks to the creative ambitions of the man who built this whole world. Irwin Allen was the producer behind Lost in Space, and he was known for his obsessive attention to detail. He wanted everything on that show to feel real, to feel advanced, to feel like an authentic glimpse into a technological future. And when it came to the control panels and computers aboard the Jupiter 2 spaceship, he made a decision that was genuinely unusual for television at the time. Instead of building fake prop computers out of wood and painted cardboard like most shows would do, Allen sourced real computers from the 1950s and 1960s to use as set decoration. These were actual machines that had been used by government agencies and research institutions. They had real buttons and real panels and real lights that actually blinked. Most viewers had no idea what they were looking at, which was kind of the whole point. These were complicated, unfamiliar machines from a world that most ordinary people never had access to. Sitting in the middle of a spaceship set, lit dramatically and dressed around with futuristic props, they looked exactly like what Allen wanted them to look like: advanced, authoritative, real. It was a small detail that most audiences never consciously noticed, but it contributed to a sense of authenticity that helped the show stand apart from its competitors. Allen cared that the world he was building felt believable, and he was willing to go to unusual lengths to make that happen. Most people think of Lost in Space as a completely original idea, a family in a spaceship lost among the stars. Where would someone even come up with that? But the truth is, the show has roots that go much, much deeper than most people realize. The show was actually based on a comic book called Space Family Robinson, which had been published in 1962. That comic followed a scientific family exploring the galaxy, but even that comic wasn't a completely original idea. It was inspired by a novel published all the way back in 1812, a classic adventure story called The Swiss Family Robinson, about a family shipwrecked on a deserted island who have to work together to survive. So when you watch Lost in Space, what you're actually watching is a story that started as a shipwreck novel in the early 1800s, got reimagined as a sci-fi comic in the early 1960s, and then got reimagined again as a television show a few years later. Irwin Allen made a deal with the comics publishers to use the family name and the basic concept, and then he built his own universe around it. The core themes, a family facing an unknown environment, learning to work together, finding ways to survive and adapt, those themes stayed consistent through every version of the story. It's a reminder that the best ideas have a way of reinventing themselves across time, finding new shapes and new audiences without ever losing what made them compelling in the first place.
And then there's the costume designer, a man who didn't get nearly enough credit for how much he shaped the visual identity of the show. His name was Paul Zastanevich, and the outfits he created for Lost in Space were unlike anything else on television at the time. He worked with silver fabrics and bold patterns and materials that felt genuinely futuristic. He thought carefully about how each costume would look under studio lights, how the colors would pop on screen, how each character's clothes could tell you something about who they were and what world they inhabited. And the work he did was good enough that in 1968, the Costume Designers Guild recognized him with an award for his contributions to the series. That might sound like a minor footnote, but think about what it actually means. In the 1960s, costume design for television, especially for science fiction, was not something people talked about or paid attention to. It was background work, something that audiences absorbed without consciously noticing. For someone working in that space to receive professional recognition was genuinely unusual. Zastanevich's designs helped create a visual language for the show that was consistent and distinctive. When you picture Lost in Space, you picture those outfits. They're part of what makes the show instantly recognizable even decades later. He wasn't just dressing actors, he was helping to build a world. Here's a connection between the two great sci-fi universes of the 1960s that comes from a very unexpected direction. Billy Mumy, the actor who played Will Robinson as a child on Lost in Space, grew up to be a lifelong fan of Star Trek. Even while he was filming the show that was technically competing with Star Trek for audience attention and network dollars, he was genuinely admiring what the other series was doing. And decades later, he got a chance to be part of it. In 1998, Mumy appeared as a guest on Star Trek Deep Space Nine. He played a character named Kellen, a soldier involved in one of the series' most intense and emotionally heavy battle episodes. The performance was praised. It wasn't a nostalgic cameo or a wink at the audience. It was a serious, dramatic role in a serious, dramatic episode, and Mumy handled it with exactly the kind of depth and skill that the material required. For fans who had grown up watching him on Lost in Space, it was a remarkable thing to witness. The boy who had once warned the galaxy about danger alongside a beloved robot was now navigating an entirely different corner of the science fiction universe decades later, and doing it beautifully. It was a full-circle moment, a bridge between two shows that had defined an era, and it showed that Billy Mumy's connection to science fiction was never just a childhood accident, it was a genuine, lifelong passion. And now we've arrived at the fact that might surprise you more than anything else on this list. Before he was one of the most celebrated composers in the history of cinema, before he wrote the music for Star Wars and Jaws and Indiana Jones and E.T. and Schindler's List and Jurassic Park, before any of that, John Williams wrote the theme music for Lost in Space. He was only 33 years old when he was hired. His name wasn't yet the cultural institution it would become. He was a talented young composer trying to build a career in Hollywood, and one of his early big opportunities was scoring a family science fiction show about a family lost in space. The producers told him what they were looking for, something futuristic, something adventurous, something that would grab the audience from the very first note, and Williams delivered something that went far beyond what anyone expected.
Instead of the simple, thin, electronic sounds that most science fiction shows of the era relied on, Williams wrote a grand, sweeping orchestral theme, full instrumentation, bold melodies, the kind of music that made you feel like you were watching something important and epic, even when the episode itself might not quite live up to that promise. His score gave the show a cinematic quality that was genuinely unusual for television in the 1960s. And here's what makes it even more remarkable. Even in the episodes that had descended into full-blown absurdity, even when the plot involved talking carrots and slapstick comedy and recycled alien costumes, the music remained bold and serious and grand. Williams never let the score descend into silliness even when everything around it had. In a way, the music was always playing the version of the show that the show was originally trying to be. You can hear in that Lost in Space theme the same DNA that would eventually become the Star Wars opening fanfare, the same sense of scale and heroism and wonder, the same instinct for melody that would make generations of moviegoers feel things they couldn't quite put into words. It all started here. It all started with a family in a spaceship and a young composer trying to find his voice. Looking back at the full sweep of what John Williams eventually accomplished, it's humbling to think that Lost in Space was one of his earliest major credits. The show gave him a platform and an audience and a challenge, and he rose to meet it in a way that pointed directly toward everything that would come after. When you watch the show today and hear that theme, you're not just hearing the music of a beloved old television series. You're hearing the very beginning of one of the greatest careers in the history of music. That's not a small thing. That's a miracle hiding in plain sight. So there you have it, 20 things about Lost in Space that most fans never knew, each one adding another layer to a show that was already more complex and more fascinating than it ever appeared on the surface. From the carrot that helped cancel the series, to the villain who was never supposed to survive past the first episode, to the stuntman who activated robot lights with his own head, to the young composer who was quietly learning how to write music that would one day define generations of moviegoers, this show was hiding extraordinary stories in every corner. Lost in Space wasn't just a campy, fun, colorful adventure show. It was a place where careers were born and broken, where real relationships developed between young actors, where creative decisions made under budget pressure somehow produced magic, and where the seeds of some of the most important art and entertainment history were quietly being planted. It deserves to be remembered not just with nostalgia, but with genuine appreciation for everything that was happening behind the scenes and between the frames. If this video surprised you, if you learned something you didn't know, or if it made you want to go back and watch Lost in Space all over again with fresh eyes, then please do one simple thing for me right now. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves classic television or old school science fiction, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time, because we do this kind of deep dive all the time, pulling back the curtain on the shows and movies and moments that shaped popular culture in ways most people never suspected. Hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. We'll see you in the next one.